I'm Tomomi Seki, a program officer of the lecture program at the Japan Society, and I'd like to welcome you this evening. Tonight we are honored to welcome Roland Kelts to Japan Society to talk about the life and the works of Osamu Tezuka. However, before we start, I'd like to thank Bangkok Tokyo Mitsubishi UFJ, Japan Airlines, United Airlines, Chris Wagenheim, and the Sunday Heck Lecture Fund for the generous sponsorship of our lecture programs. Also, as a preview of an upcoming program on November 14, next Thursday, we will hold a lecture and tasting event, A Taste of Home Japanese Curry. It's on sale, so please enjoy our curry event if you're interested. To learn more about other upcoming lecture programs, please visit our website at japansociety.org. I'm also pleased to announce that we're holding a raffle tonight, so please be sure to fill out the survey, which is in your program, and turn it in. We'll walk around and collect the survey after the event, so please make sure to fill it out. And the winner will be announced later this evening, right after the event. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, Ms. Katie Skelly. Katie is a modern cartoonist whose work has been influenced by the manga of Osamu Tezuka, particularly titles like Blackjack and The Book of Human Insects. She lives and works in Queens, New York. Her first graphic novel, Nurse Nurse, was published by Sparklight Books, is that right? In 2012, and her next work, Operation Margarine, will be published by House Books in spring 2014. She also holds a BA in art history from Syracuse University. Her book is available for sale, so if you're interested, you can talk to her and buy her book from the table over there, and she will be autographing after the event. Now, without further ado, please welcome Katie to the podium.
Hi, thank you, Tomomi. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Roland Kelts. Roland is a writer, editor, and lecturer who divides his time between New York and Tokyo. He regularly presents on contemporary Japanese culture around the world and has taught at numerous universities in Japan and the United States, including New York University and the University of Tokyo. He is also the author of Japanamerica, How Japanese Pop Culture Invaded the U.S. His other fiction and nonfiction works have appeared in numerous publications, such as The New Yorker, Time Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, Psychology Today, Playboy, Vogue Japan, The Yomiuri, and The Guardian. He is the editor-in-chief of the Anime Masterpieces Screening and Discussion Program, the commentator for National Public Radio's series Pacific Rim Diary, and the author of a monthly column for the Japan Times. One of his latest projects is the English edition, of the Japanese literary culture magazine, Monkey Business. He is currently a visiting scholar at Keio University. Without further ado, please help me welcome Roland Kelts.
Thank you very much for coming out this evening to talk about probably the most transformative artist in the history of what we think of as manga and anime from Japan, Mr. Osamu Tezuka. I first want to thank the Japan Society for having me back. I've been here a couple of times now, and Tomomi in particular, Sekia, for arranging this evening, and Katie for joining me up here. It's a real honor to be with a real tried and true artist up on the stage. So it's great to be here, and I want to thank the Japan Society and all of you for coming. It's a real privilege to be able to sit here this evening and talk with you about Osamu Tezuka. When I first started conducting research for a book that is called Japanamerica, everyone told me you have to go speak to the people at Tezuka Productions, his production studio. And it was the beginning of a whole odyssey for me. I knew about anime, I knew about manga, my mother's Japanese, I went to kindergarten in Japan. So it wasn't alien to me, and I was certainly a huge fan of certain titles. but I didn't know how much Osamu Tezuka had shaped these forms that we know today. And really, I think, in the words of my good friend Frederick L. Schott, who has written about Tezuka and was Tezuka's interpreter, he created the template for what we think of as modern manga and anime coming from Japan. So what I'm going to do is start with a bit of a presentation, not too heavy, to introduce Tezuka as a character, as a person, and to try to describe how he affected the form of modern manga and anime, and B, how he affected the content of modern manga and anime. Tezuka was outrageously prolific. He created, I think somebody said 150,000 pages at least of work over his life. It is fundamentally impossible for me this evening to cover even a margin of what he accomplished. So I hope this, for those of you who are not acquainted with Tezuka, I hope this is a kind of launching point for you to explore the mammoth amount of work that he created. And for those of you who are familiar with him, I hope this will help sort of shape your understanding of who he was and how important he remains. So I have here this opening graphic, of course, Tezuka himself, who passed away at the age of 60, much too young for a man of his stature and vigor, in 1989. What's interesting about the dates, and I hope you can see them up there, 1929 to 1989, that roughly corresponds with a very specific period in Japanese history. And I want this to be interactive even before we do Q&A. Anybody tell me what that period is in Japanese history? Sure, Clyde, you're right there.
Showa.
The Showa era, and what does that mean?
That means the Showa emperor. He was an emperor from 1926 to
Exactly.
1989 or 8 or 9.
1989, 1926 to 1989. So Tezuka's life almost exactly corresponds with the Showa era in Japan, the era of Emperor Hirohito, who of course became a very controversial figure because of World War II. So Tezuka lived through some pretty turbulent and transformational times in Japan. And I think it's important to keep in mind when we talk about him as an artist, at least a snippet of his biography. He was born and raised in Osaka, Western Japan, otherwise known as the Kansai area in Japan. And he was born the son of a doctor, a very well-regarded and highly regarded physician in Osaka. So he grew up with relative wealth, especially at the time he was raised, which was during and after World War II. And what that means in terms of Tezuka as an artist, and by the way, he went to medical school and earned his degree. He is technically Dr. Tezuka, even though we think of him as Osamu Tezuka. But what it means for him as an artist is that when Osamu was a young boy, he had access to a lot of Western influences. In fact, his father imported Western comics. So the young Tezuka actually had access to classic American comics of the early and mid-century, Blondie, Dagwood and Blondie, some of you know that classic American comic. He had access to the works of Max Fleischer. Fleischer is famous for, of course, Popeye and Betty Boop and Felix the Cat. Felix the Cat, who's still quite popular in Japan, by the way. You can find toys in the shops of Felix the Cat. He had access to this stuff, and so he was heavily influenced by Western comics. And of course, the classic among those is Walt Disney. And Tezuka claimed to have watched Disney's Bambi, which was his favorite Disney movie, over 80 times. Now, he would have been watching them on reels, right? It wasn't YouTube. He wasn't downloading BitTorrents. And that means that the family had enough wealth to be able to access this material. Now, after the war, after 1945, American popular culture would flood into Japan. Comics, jazz, rock and roll. When I interviewed Haruki Murakami, the Japanese novelist, he said, after the war, you couldn't avoid American culture. It was everywhere. So I have this opening graphic here, Tezuka's years, of course, corresponding with the Showa era, but also you have his most famous character, Astro Boy, or Tetsuwan Atom, and probably Disney's most famous character, Mickey Mouse. And they're two very, very different characters. They may be iconic in their countries, but one of the crucial differences, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that Tezuka's character is not always chipper or happy-go-lucky, but is more often quite perplexed and troubled. Partly because he's not sure of who he is, identity. He is half robot, half boy, and isn't sure which one of himself is more superior to the other. And partly because his goal is not justice, like most American comic book heroes. His goal is world peace, arguably much more difficult to achieve. So Tezuka grows up in Osaka. He is raised by a doctor. He has access to Western culture that most other young Japanese at that time wouldn't have had access to. He is also himself achieves a medical degree, so he's an intellectual, he's a smart young man. And he chooses in 1948 to draw comics. And as he said, his mother told him, do what you love. Do what you love. That's a real privilege at any point in your life, but especially after your country has lost a world war. Do what you love. So this is the Tezuka we're talking about. He emerges as a workaholic, an intellectual, a deeply competitive person from day one. And he can be very difficult, I can assure you. I've heard firsthand. But also raised in this very exciting atmosphere. He not only lived in Osaka, but he was very close to a theater review that's still going strong today. Does anybody know what that theater is called? In Osaka? Takaratsuka, exactly. And what's interesting, what's cool about Takaratsuka? What distinguishes it?
It's all women.
All women performing all the roles. There's a photograph of a young Tezuka sitting on the lap of one of these female artists, very glamorous, and imagine Broadway stars times 10. And they're beautiful women who perform as beautiful men and beautiful women on the stage. They perform all the roles. And there's a picture of a young Tezuka sitting on one of these actors' laps. And what's interesting about that is you'll find in his art, as he matures, a lot of gender bending and gender play in his, especially later in mid-comics and films. So this is the guy that we're talking about tonight. And I also want to include, because we've just talked about all these Western influences, the fact that Tezuka was also, as I said, an intellectual as a young man, read widely, knew his own culture very, very well. And I have a couple of, this is sort of sacrilegious because I shouldn't be putting two ukiyo-e prints on top of each other, but for the sake of compression and time, you have some samples of ukiyo-e or woodblock printing, which were the popular pop culture of their time in the, starting from the 16th century in Japan. And Tezuka was very much aware of this cultural tradition. And I draw your attention to two formatic elements of ukiyo-e. On the one hand, you have probably the most famous ukiyo-e or woodblock print in the world, which is the Great Wave off Kanagawa. And you can see from this image, the power of the image is in the lines, the outlines. Do you notice the edge of that wave, the foam? Looks like fingers, right? fingers attacking. At this point, most Japanese artists, because Japan was closed, of course, were not influenced by Western approaches to multi-dimensional imagery or the illusion of 3D. So you see in this image very little shading. There's very little attempt to create distance. Distance is there, obviously, in the perspective you get on Mount Fuji, which is tiny compared to this massive, possibly tsunami, it's not confirmed, but massive wave. But most of the power is in the line. And if you've read manga, whether it's Tezuka's or anyone else's, if you've watched anime, one thing you notice right away is, unlike Pixar's Toy Story, it's not attempting to create a three-dimensional world. The power of the art is in the line. Perhaps the most famous example of that in the US now is Hayao Miyazaki's films. If you've seen Totoro or any of his classic films, there's no three-dimensionality at all. It's all a 2D world whose power and evocation is drawn from line work, the outline. And you can see that in this ukiyo-e here as well, and I included this because it's also a fairly bawdy image. I mean, it looks classic now because it's now ukiyo-e is hung in museums, but it's fairly risque. And that was another element of Japanese popular art that Tezuka would have inherited. That you can not only draw violent scenes and draw comic scenes and draw heroic scenes, but you can also explore eros in the artifacts themselves. Now, beyond the Japanese cultural elements, Tezuka really pioneered this, and this is, I think, very important when we talk about form, and he's not the only manga artist to have what my friend Fred again calls decompressed the action in the frame. But I want you to look, these are very early frames of from New Treasure Island. And I point to them because you can see, especially here in these two on the right, how the action in the frames is slowed down by the frames. It's broken up so that you have to look at each frame and essentially have to enter into the action of the frame. Instead of the collision that may be coming being a splashy image in the center of the page, you get here 4 frames where you're essentially just getting closer and closer and closer to the character's face, which is registering alarm, and to the action itself, but you're not yet there. And this use of decompression, comparatively, makes manga, for the reader who's primed for it, I argue, more like the experience of reading fiction, reading a short story, or reading a novel. You actually have to do some of the work and experience the suspense that the artist is creating. Because he's not going to give you a splashy collision in the middle of the page in full color. He's going to slow it down and break it up into units and frames. And if you've ever looked at manga, contemporary manga, you know, it's not uncommon to have 7, even 9 frames on a single page. That was very much an element of what Tezuka pioneered. And if you look at American comics from the same time period, you don't see that happening. It's 4 panels, maybe 1 big shot in the middle. You know, Superman goes like this and knocks out a villain high above the city. But you don't get this slowed down intimacy that Tezuka very much pioneered. Again, he was not the only manga artist of his generation doing this, but he really opened it up to a mass audience. So you have the Western influences, you have the sense, his deep sense of his cultural roots in Japanese art and aesthetics, and then you have this novel approach to breaking up action and breaking into frames.
I have a question about this. Do you think that this type of storytelling, slowing down the action, decompressing it, came from his love of cinema as well, his love of Bambi?
I think that's an excellent point, and it wasn't just Bambi, he loved Chinese cinema as well. The story Son Goku, it's what you call in Japanese, the Journey to the West. Yes, was one of his favorite films, and he tried to watch it again and again and again. And so it's an excellent point. It was partly his love of cinema. I think also, I think it's fair to say his love of literature. He read Greek mythology, he read the Bible. He was extremely well read. He read Dostoevsky, he made manga about Dostoevsky, based on Dostoevsky. So he was also very keenly aware of literary technique. And how do you make a scene, you know, if Raskolnikov is going to axe his landlady, how do you approach that drama and make it more meaningful for the reader than just showing an axe, you know, the scene? So I think, I think film, I think also literature.
Right.
It was extremely well read. And Katie actually supplied this incredible image. Anybody know who the artist is?
Jack Kirby.
Jack Kirby, right. And maybe I should let Katie explain this.
This is an image, this is a double splash page from Mr. Miracle number 8 as printed in the Fourth World Omnibus volume 3. And what we have here is just kind of a mess. I love Kirby, but we have just a ton of characters, a ton of simultaneous action. And when you really look at this, it almost looks like every character in this could have their own comic book just about them. But these were all sort of just supplemental characters in this story. So a ton of action all happening at the same time.
It's almost a too perfect expression of the compression of action versus the decompression of action that Tezuka and some of his peers pioneered in manga. Here, everything is almost happening at once. And this is certainly not, I mean, you can pick up Spider-Man comics and so on where the action is compressed very intensely and full color like this, you know, very, very colorful, loud, intense. But in my reading experience, what I love about the decompressing of action is that I feel like I'm more vulnerable as the reader to what's happening on the page. Here, I feel like it's spectacle, fantastic spectacle, thrilling even. But when I read a good manga, and it doesn't have to be manga, or good American artists doing that kind of work, I feel like I'm vulnerable, I'm involved, I'm part of the experience. So this is a great example of just the opposite of what Tezuka was trying to do. And then we can't forget that Tezuka not only was a transformative figure in the evolution of manga, but also in what we think of as anime, or Japanese animation. He was the first to create a series for Japanese television in 1963. Astro Boy debuted on Japanese TV. Not only on Japanese TV, but also on NBC in the United States. The same year. It's hard to sort of, you know, now everything seems simultaneous, but in 1963 for a Japanese artist to debut on Japanese TV and American TV, network TV, with an animated series was an extraordinary accomplishment. And it has to be said that Tezuka wanted to have a global audience. He self-consciously created certain characters that looked Western, as I'm sure you know if you've seen Astro Boy or any of his other works. He self-consciously created a lot of signage in English, very deliberately, so NBC would accept more episodes. He would include Western symbols like crosses and synagogues. And NBC, he was actually baffled because NBC actually complained. He said, we don't want that stuff, people are going to get upset. They're not going to know what you're trying to say, so get rid of it. And they even actually, NBC complained about the English. They said, don't use so much English. He was completely baffled. He thought he was doing the right thing and making his work more accessible. But I point out here just an incredibly simple explanation of what has come to be called limited animation. And in Japan, in the early years and even today, limited animation was the technique most commonly used to get a show onto the screen. It's true, TV series from Japan today. A lot of them employ limited animation. And what that means, in this very basic setup. But if you look at the graphic on the bottom, this is what Tezuka actually admired in Walt Disney's works. The fluidity of movement, where each movement of the character is drawn separately on separate cells, so that the character appears to move realistically through space. Of course it's an illusion because you're drawing it, but this was full animation. In Japan, lacking the resources, finances, equipment, they opted for what's called limited animation, and you can see the difference. The character hasn't changed at all. They haven't drawn any movement in between for the character. Instead, the character, the same image, is just shown in different contexts, different positions. And if any of you have watched Japanese anime television series especially, but even films, a lot of this jump cut edginess, it's actually come to be cool now, the style of cutting from one scene to another, and the fast close-up, and then the fast reverse, and then the perspective change. A lot of that is from limited animation, because there wasn't the money there or the resources to do the full fluid animation, so things became herky-jerky and quick, and that became a style, in a way. And this is not, it shouldn't surprise us, right? I mean, punk music was created in garages, and that was a better sound than the Eagles, right? For a certain audience. You had hip-hop in the Bronx, nobody wanted it to sound like Donna Summer. So it's not a shock, but this is where that style that we think of as anime style partly came from. And I'm going to quickly show a short video clip with some talking heads, including me, to sort of give you a sense, hopefully, of the context of war and how it affected Tezuka in terms of content. We've been talking about form and style in his biography, but the content of his work really transformed manga and then anime. Oops. Hang on a sec. How do I go back? Keep pushing it up. Okay, it seems to be going forward. Okay, this is it. So how do I play it? Okay. So this just gives you a kind of overview of especially how the war impacted his work.
Japanese comic books or graphic novels, characterized by highly stylized art.
If you're going to talk about anime, you have to look at manga first.
Manga is widely read in Japan by children and adults. The stories cover subjects that range from action-adventure, science fiction and fantasy, to romance, horror, sports, and pornography. Manga is growing in popularity worldwide and represents a market of almost $5 billion US a year. The stories that are successful as manga are often translated into anime. Contemporary manga originates just after the Second World War in a post-apocalyptic Japan. Artists found a new freedom of expression as the country was rebuilt. Western culture, in the form of film, art, and literature, became more commonplace and influential. One artist emerged to shape the storytelling style of manga. His distinct approach became the inspiration for modern anime.
Osamu Tezuka has been referred to as the Disney of Japan, and rightfully so, I would say. Tezuka could do it all. Virtually every genre of Japanese comics could be said to have been invented by him.
Tezuka was a very wealthy kid. I mean, he grew up in Osaka, so he had access to these old Disney reels. Tezuka claimed to have seen Bambi 80 times, sitting in the theater, in the dark theater with his sketchbook, copying Bambi. But his vision was to take a Japanese aesthetic and combine it with Disney's brilliantly cinematic style of storytelling.
Osamu Tezuka created a world uniquely his own, with a filmic shorthand that exploded the stillness of manga's black and white graphic universe.
I love the camera angles and the pacing and the way he would tell stories that lasted hundreds of pages. It was like using the panels of the comic like frames in a film.
But he also blended a lot of different influences from Tex Avery and Looney Tunes and Mickey Mouse.
He was just incredibly protean. I mean, he would make manga about Nazi Germany, and then he would create his own characters such as Astro Boy or Mighty Atom. And then he went out and sold his own books to commuters, people heading back to work in a pretty much decimated Tokyo.
Tezuka's manga captured the imagination of a shell-shocked audience hungry for meaning in post-apocalyptic Japan.
His great influence was the war. Manga was an underground expression of post-World War II Japanese trauma.
Tezuka's love of American animation and the popularity of his manga stories inspired his decision to make the move. Astro Boy became the first domestically produced animated series on Japanese television.
This theme song is still played in Japanese schools and in gymnasiums. Everybody knows it.
Put it all into a blender, mixed with his own dark, tragic themes, and then spit it back out in a way that I think was very accessible to kids, but also spoke to adults.
My son. My son.
So you completed it after all. This may mean trouble.
I'm taking him with me. I'll bring him up as my son. You can do whatever you like, but you're not taking my son away from me.
You really can trace just about everything back to this one guy. Everybody who came after, all are kind of in the shadow of Tezuka Sensei.
Astro Boy's success marks the start of the anime craze in Japan. The rest of the world, including Hollywood, would soon follow.
Okay, so you can see there, on the one hand, Tezuka creating a template in which you could address really any topic in manga and anime, from post-World War II horrors to Russian literature, to any color of sexuality or of even perversion in the human psyche. Manga and later anime could try to address those issues. In addition, as you can see from this graphic, Tezuka, being a doctor, wanted his characters, Astro Boy in this case, to have some semblance to reality. So in other words, he designed Astro Boy as something that pseudo-scientifically could actually exist. That the technology would be there and the anatomical science would be there. And the reason I included this graphic is because if you're aware of Giant Robot series coming out of Japan, Giant Robot being the mecha genre, a huge genre in manga and anime, you'll know that a classic series, for example, such as Gundam, which is huge in Japan, the creator, Yoshiyuki Tomino, was himself a scientist and created the robot based on scientific possibility. So it wasn't as simple as just creating a robot or even an Astro Boy, but creating one that you could actually believe in. The influence, of course, of Tezuka was so great that it caused an incredible controversy when Walt Disney released The Lion King. It's impossible to talk about Tezuka without talking about this controversy, so I'll mention it briefly. But there are certainly many people who feel that his classic animation, Jungle Taite, or Kimba the White Lion as it's known outside of Japan, was either out of homage or plagiarism taken on by Walt Disney for The Lion King. I think what's interesting about that controversy today, because Tezuka's people are over it, the Disney people are over it, is that it shows a turning point where American artists and other artists in the West were beginning to look at Japan for models of how to do this better. And today, when you go to Pixar studios in Northern California, everyone there has a little Totoro doll on their desk, or a picture of Miyazaki, or a signed photo of Miyazaki, because for them, the great animator of our time is Japanese artist Hayao Miyazaki. So if you think of Tezuka in 1964, shaking hands with Walt Disney at the New York World's Fair, And then today, in 2013, John Lasseter of Pixar, bowing down in deep respect to Hayao Miyazaki. You almost see this Mobius strip of interaction, this cultural exchange that arguably has come full circle, where young American artists now look at Tezuka or manga and see inspiration in how to create their work. I put up here a graphic from, anybody know what this is? Princess Knight, right? Which is, in many people's opinion, the beginning of what another genre of manga called shoujo manga, or girls manga. And Tezuka, very early on, 1953, had a main character whose heart was part male and part female, and who was constantly trying to decide which gender they needed to pursue, the character needed to pursue. It's the 60th anniversary of Princess Knight, and so I thought I would include this picture to show just how on top of things he was exploring these gender questions in 1953 in manga, and creating really an offspring, a whole genre, which of course, after Tezuka created Princess Knight, most of the artists who create shoujo manga today and soon after are women. So he was sort of this male progenitor who created this genre, and then women took over. And there are many, many successful women manga artists in Japan today. Unlike in the United States right now, I mean, I think Katie's probably a shining example of a new wave of young Americans who are making comics, female comic artists coming out of a new generation in the United States.
Yes, thank you. So just a question about Princess Knight. It seems like Tezuka created a lot of characters that have conflict that's kind of based just on their form, an internal sort of struggle between my heart is half male, half female, I'm a robot, I have mechanics inside of me, I can't really grow. Even in Blackjack, there's kind of a conflict between, am I a doctor, am I sort of, like cavalier, am I here to help, and also in Blackjack, there's that character, Pinocchio, who was, she was like an internal twin, and she's born and her mind keeps developing, she keeps aging, but her body doesn't. So I wonder where that sort of, does that conflict come from within Tezuka himself, sort of not knowing if he wants to be a doctor or an artist?
That's an excellent question, and could probably take another hour to answer it, but in shorthand, what comes to mind to me is that, as we said at the very beginning, he was a Showa-era artist, almost literally, for a couple of years, 1929 to 1989, and if you look at what Japan went through in those years, the intensity of the militarization, the military coup in the 1930s, the occupation by the United States, which was 7 years, 1945 to 1952, and then arguably the polarization of Japanese society as it became economically rich. Suddenly there was a lower class, suddenly there were the corporate barons, there were the uber wealthy, suddenly the environment was being destroyed without question, in many cases in the 70s and 80s. And Tezuka lived through all this, and I think maybe the question gets at why his characters, in most respects, as you point out, couldn't quite overcome their dichotomies, could never quite resolve. There's very little Tezuka work that ends happily. In fact, I can't think of any, actually, that would end arguably with what we call a resolution that feels somewhat comforting or satisfying. And I don't know if we'll have time, because I want to make sure we open this up to discussion, but there is a short film here, and if we have time, it's about a 5-minute film that he made near the end of his life called Jumping. And he started making these sort of films on the side that didn't fit any format. They weren't for TV, they weren't for cinema, he just made them because he wanted to make them. And they're quite extraordinary. There's about 13 or 14 of them that he made. And Jumping is really amazing, and it's this incredible narrative in which you are actually the main character. He's almost asking you to resolve these questions. But I think it's fair to say that you can look at Tezuka's career and very much see the identity crisis of modern Japan in his work, almost that he anticipated this divided self, a country that was almost maybe number one economically in the 1980s, that doesn't have a military. I'm not saying it should have a military, I'm not taking that political position, but it doesn't. It's almost unprecedented in human history. How can a nation state be so powerful and rich and have no military, no occupation, no army? There's something inherently suspicious about that state of being. And when you live in Japan, as I do, and you visit a US military base, an hour from Tokyo, and you see the US fighter jets doing formations and taking off and landing, and you're an hour from Tokyo, it's hard not to wonder what it would be like to take a train from Grand Central out to Long Island and see Japanese fighter planes taking off and landing by the coast, or Russian fighter planes, and how that might make you feel in your own country in 2013 to see this still happening. Whether you would feel relieved that you're protected, whether you would feel belligerent about what still might feel like an occupation.
Right.
I think Tezuka raises a lot of those questions about identity. I think that's a good point. Yeah. So I don't know if we'll have time for jumping, and I definitely want to have time for your comments. So we'd like to open the floor. We've sort of covered a lot of ground in a short period of time out of necessity. But I think they have a microphone, is that right?
Yes, we should.
For questions, and maybe Katie
Yes.
will take it over.
Sure. So if you wouldn't mind just please waiting for the microphone to get to you, and then I'll call on whoever has a question. Just raise your hand.
Thank you. So my question is, I'm doing research for a children's book to bring knowledge to children of America about Tezuka Osamu. So many people know manga, they know Naruto, Dragon Ball, One Piece. They don't know the main figure behind it. And you mentioned that people told you to get in contact with people like Mr. Schott and Tezuka Productions. I wanted to know what would be a good way to do that, because I would want to see how they felt about the project, and it's not something I'm doing for personal gain, it's just because I want to spread awareness, because I'm also an anime and manga teacher at an elementary school.
Great.
And I'm using it to teach my students, but I want to inform all of America. So that's my question, how could I get in contact with such individuals?
My first bit of advice would be to write directly to Tezuka Productions in Tokyo. They have English-speaking staff, and the people there following Tezuka's lead really want to spread the wealth around the world. Not every anime studio is that open-minded or that international. Tezuka Productions really want, because Tezuka wanted his work to be seen around the world. They are following his lead, and I'm sure you'll get a response from them.
I'm glad to hear that, thank you so much.
Sure.
So you opened up the presentation to the stylistic innovations that Tezuka created. Can you put this presentation in the context of society? I mean, what's the demographic that was reading his work? What works appeal to certain age groups? What did he do for literacy?
Literacy?
Yeah.
Well, as you probably know, Japan has, even today, an extraordinarily high literacy rate compared with most other developed nations. I think they still report it as 98, 99% literacy. And a lot of Japanese educators have pointed to manga and said that it gets young people reading. And it was interesting because one professor at the University of Tokyo said to me, reading is a mechanical act. It's partly physical. You have to learn how to turn the pages, how to sit still with something in front of you that you have to decode. Right? I mean, a movie just comes at you. You might have to decode some of the dialogue or something, but you can just watch. But reading is mechanical. You have to actually physically do something. And you have to, be active. And so this professor was saying to me, if young Japanese start reading manga and get hooked, they learn the mechanics of reading. So they may move on to Tale of Genji, right, at university. But when they learn the mechanics of reading and the habit of reading, they don't forget it. They don't give it up. So one argument, to answer your question, is that manga itself has done a lot for literacy in Japan.
Does the formal establishment have the cojones to sort of tell enough of that?
I think they do now, because the older ones are dying, and the younger ones grew up with manga. I don't mean to be rude, but the younger ones grew up with manga. I mean, my Japanese uncle is 74, and he doesn't like a lot of anime or a lot of manga, but he loves Tezuka. And he said Osamu Tezuka was a genius. He was brilliant. So, and I think to answer your other question, Tezuka, as I said earlier, he was incredibly competitive, incredibly prolific. I mean, mind-bendingly prolific, which is why he was not the greatest manga artist. He's not the greatest draftsperson, right? Many manga artists alive today are more skilled in terms of sheer technique, but Tezuka could churn it out, and churn it out on deadline, and make good stories, and make people entertained, and try all kinds of different stories and themes and ideas. So he was this really magical figure in a way. And even in the 1960s and 70s, when some of you know the term gekiga, these sort of more adult-oriented comics, which had more erotic stuff and more violence and more sort of seedy underworld stuff, when that was emerging, instead of saying, oh, I don't need to go there, Tezuka jumped right in. And he made, Mew, he made the stories he wanted, he thought would be greater gekiga than the gekiga was out there. He was basically stepping into the ring with all these younger artists saying, I can do that. I can do it better than you can do it.
Did he ever open the ring up for innovative storytelling prior to that?
Prior to that, well, yeah, I think he did. I mean, I think Tezuka's a complicated figure because on the one hand, as I said, he was very competitive. I should mention, those of you who know about the anime industry know there's still a term called the curse of Osamu. And that term has to do with the fact that Osamu, who was fairly successful and well off, would what we now call dump his anime series very cheap for TV studios, set the price very low so no one could compete with it. And that sadly pertains to this day. Television and networks in Japan expect to pay very little for anime episodes, and the industry still, if you say the curse of Osamu, they're gospel. Yeah, that's it. It's him. He did it. So, and he could be brutal with the competition. He didn't like competition. On the other side, and this is often the contradictory nature of artists, he is really the reason there is what they call doujinshi subculture in Japan, fan art. I think we call it fan art here, right? That whole industry, the comics market in Japan, is all fans creating their own artwork, often based on officially published work. Well, that's been going since 1975. And the first doujin work, the first fan art, was published in Tezuka's own comics magazine, because his readers were sending in, graphics and saying, I love you, Osamu, here's my work, and he said to his editors, why don't we publish some of this stuff? And publish some of the best fan art we get every month. And that started in 1970. 1975 was the first comics market. And today, there are two of them. They tell twice a year, and they get 500,000 people to each one. It's an industry on its own. And you could argue that Tezuka is the reason it happened, that he cultivated it.
Is there work in his Uber that you can sort of pull out and say, this is pretty cool, this is innovative storytelling?
I think The Phoenix is amazing. He made some epic books. The Phoenix is based on the Greek myth, but he did it as manga. He also rendered the story of the Buddha as a, I think they have that here tonight. As a manga, yeah, they have it. I mean, these are epic works. Another one, which is really quite groundbreaking, is called Ayako, which was recently published in English. And that, I think, is available back there, which is this incredible exploration of a very dark world of sexuality. Beautifully done. So I think any of those works, I think The Phoenix holds a special place with me. I just think he really blew the doors off with that manga. It's amazing.
So I think we have time for one more question, so the young lady up here.
Hi, I wanted to ask more about the Gekika work that he has done. In particular, the Mushi Pro productions in the later years. Also, the works like the trilogy that he had done, I believe the Arabian Nights, Cleopatra, and the startling, very different but very dark, the Belladonna of Sadness. I was just wondering, after that Belladonna of Sadness, I believe they went bankrupt.
Yes.
Whatever happened to some of those wonderful animators?
Well, the animators themselves probably moved on to other studios. Mushi Productions was his first studio, and Tezuka was not a very good businessman. He often made some decisions, like a lot of artists, just based on his heart and his own desires. And he kind of let Mushi Pro go bankrupt. It has been revived. It still exists, actually, in a rundown old building in West Tokyo. And Ito-san, an older gentleman, is running it. And they still make these sort of films on the side, on a very low budget. But later, Tezuka Productions took over all the rights. So I suspect the answer to your question would lie with Tezuka Pro, because they're kind of the king rights holders now. And Mushi Pro is like this little old affiliate that they keep alive, that just barely out in West Tokyo. Yeah, Tezuka, I mean, again, I've talked about his accomplishments tonight, but he was a difficult guy, and he was also quite a self-destructive guy. He took on far more work than he probably should have. A lot of people who knew him, some of you may know this Japanese term karoshi, death by overwork, which came to be applied to Japanese businessmen who worked way too hard and never went home and just died at their desks. And some people say Tezuka was an example of that in the artistic world, that he just took on way too much work, said yes to everybody, and tried to beat everybody at the game when he should have probably taken a vacation.
Yes, that is something that I take to heart, for sure. I think we can all learn from that. Any inspiring manga artists in the audience, please be careful. Don't work yourselves too hard. I know it's tempting, and I do it all the time. So at this point, I think we're about ready to wrap up. So if you filled out your survey for this event tonight, we'll be around to collect that. We'll be announcing who won the raffle of the books from Kinokuniya and other places at the end of this event. And then maybe while we're taking surveys, would you like to play jumping?
Oh, yes. So we can play jumping in the background here, which is from the 1980s, later in Tezuka's career, and was a short 5-minute film in which he was being very experimental. And you'll see, you almost go through the entire history of civilization. You go into the agrarian age, the industrial age, corporate era of cities developing, and then you descend into what seems inevitable to Tezuka, which is conflict and war. And unfortunately, you emerge back where you started. It's called jumping. There's no dialogue at all.
It's extraordinary. As Katie pointed out, this is an artist whose career, almost his career, was built on creating characters that would be memorable. And here he tries his hand at creating a short film where there's really no characters at all. And technically speaking, because it's from your perspective, you're the character in the story. So really, Tezuka, in so many aspects of his work, he would just try something. I mean, he had the confidence and the talent to try his hand at executing all kinds of different styles of work. And so while he may be most famous for Astro Boy, I think you could really, use that quite honorary term artist in looking at his career and how brave he was and bold he was and how much he accomplished in a relatively short life.
I think that's a great place to end for tonight. So I'd like to say thank you to Roland.